My own son and his wife were poisoning me in my home, thinking I was just a frail old woman who was in their way. They smiled to my face every day while serving me the very tea that was meant to end my life, all so they could get their hands on my inheritance. They saw me as nothing more than a conclusion to a story they wanted over with. But they made one fatal mistake. They underestimated me. And the secret plan I put in motion would not only save my life, but would destroy theirs in the most satisfying public takedown imaginable. You know you reach a certain age, and you start to believe you've seen every color of human nature. You think you can read the weather in a person's face, see the storm brewing in their eyes long before the rain falls. I was wrong. I was living in the grand, quiet house my late husband Arthur and I had built a place filled with the ghosts of happy memories, and I thought I understood the people who shared it with me. That Sunday, the illusion was still mostly intact, though the edges were starting to fray. We were having brunch in the sunroom, a place that always felt like it was suspended in amber light. My son Thomas and his wife Clarissa had been living with me for the past 6 months, ever since my health took a bit of a turn. On the surface, it was a picture of familial devotion. The table was set with the good china, the silver gleaming. But the air was thick with something unspoken heavy, like the humidity before a thunderstorm. Clarissa was playing her part beautifully. She was the very image of a dutiful daughter-in-law, fluffing my pillows, cutting my food into small, manageable bites. But when she'd put her hand on my arm to guide me to the table, her grip was like a vice. Her nails, perfectly manicured, dug into my thin skin. Her smile never quite reached her eyes. It was a bright, brittle thing, a piece of glass that could shatter at any moment. I saw it. I felt it. But I told myself I was being uncharitable. Thomas was a different kind of storm. He sat opposite me, his handsome face drawn and pale. He barely touched his food. His entire world was contained in the little black rectangle of his phone, his thumb swiping and tapping in a frantic rhythm. Every few seconds, a flicker of raw panic would cross his face, a look I hadn't seen on him since he was a little boy who'd broken a vase and was waiting for his father to come home. He was my son, my only child, and it was like looking at a stranger who just happened to be wearing his face. The whole scene felt wrong, a beautifully staged play where all the actors had forgotten their lines. My home, my beautiful, sun-drenched home, had started to feel like the most elegant prison in all of Westchester County. In the weeks that followed that brunch, the gilded bars of my cage grew stronger. Clarissa began managing my life with a chilling efficiency, all under the guise of protecting my fragile health. My oldest friends would call, and Clarissa would answer, her voice dripping with syrupy concern, explaining that Eleanor was resting and couldn't be disturbed. She'd say they would only tire me out. Soon the calls stopped coming altogether. The mail, once a small pleasure of my day, now went directly into Clarissa's hands. She'd sort through it at the kitchen island, telling me it was just bills and junk, that she would take care of everything. I was being gently, methodically erased from my own life. And then there was the tea. Every evening without fail, she would bring me a cup of what she called her herbal wellness tea. It was a murky, bitter concoction that she swore would soothe my nerves and help me sleep. She would stand over me with that fixed smile until I had drained the cup, ignoring my protests about the awful taste. She insisted it was for my own good. The real betrayal, the one that truly locked the door on my cage, happened on a Tuesday afternoon. Clarissa came into my study with a cheerful bustle and a thick stack of papers. She said they were just some routine estate documents from our lawyer, a few tax forms that needed my signature. My hands had grown unsteady over the years, and the fine print swam before my eyes. She knelt beside my chair, her perfume cloying and sweet. She pointed to each signature line, her finger guiding my pen. "It's just a tedious but necessary formality," she'd murmured, her voice like silk. I remember the scratch of the pen, the feel of her hand over mine, firm and controlling. I signed where she told me to sign. I trusted her. I trusted my son's wife. I didn't see the words "durable power of attorney" or "medical directive" hidden between the pages of mundane financial records. That night, the tea felt stronger than usual. It left a fog in my mind and a leaden weight in my limbs. I drifted off to sleep in my armchair, but some deep, primal instinct woke me a few hours later. The house was dark and silent, but then I heard voices from the hallway, hushed but sharp with venom. It was Thomas and Clarissa. Thomas's voice was a ragged whisper frayed with desperation. He said something about a final margin call being on Friday, that they had nothing left. His words were choked with the terror of a man at the edge of a cliff. And then I heard Clarissa. Her voice wasn't panicked. It was calm. It was the calm of a frozen lake, perfectly smooth and miles deep. "She's a conclusion, Thomas, not a chapter," she said, her words slicing through the darkness. "It's time she lies down with the worms." In that moment, the fog in my head didn't just clear, it vaporized. A horrifying crystalline clarity washed over me, so sharp and cold, it burned. The weakness, the disorientation, the unnaturally deep sleep. It wasn't my age, it wasn't my health. It was the bitter tea I drank every single night. The tea wasn't medicine for my nerves, it was poison. They weren't caring for me. They were waiting for me to die, and they had grown tired of waiting. By the way, if you're enjoying the story so far, please consider subscribing so you don't miss what's next. We'd also love to hear your own story if you'd like to share it with our community. Now, let's get back to it. I didn't sleep that night. I sat there in my armchair as the moon traced its silver path across the floor, and the terror that had seized me slowly, piece by piece, solidified into something else. It became cold, hard, and sharp. It became a plan. The frail, trusting old woman they thought I was had died in that hallway. In her place sat someone they had never met, someone who was now fighting for her life. When morning came, I was ready. I practiced letting my hands tremble. I practiced a vacant, confused look in my eyes. I was no longer Eleanor Grace matriarch. I was an actress, and this was the role of a lifetime. Clarissa brought in the tea on a little tray, her smile as bright and false as ever. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my hands remained perfectly, artificially unsteady. As she set the cup and saucer on the table beside me, I reached for it, letting my fingers twitch, just so. My hand jerked, as if struck by a sudden palsy, and the cup went flying. The dark, bitter liquid splashed across a priceless Persian rug, a wedding gift from Arthur's parents. It was a spectacular mess. Thomas, who had been hovering anxiously in the doorway, let out a little gasp and rushed to clean it up, dabbing at the stain with a napkin. Clarissa's face tightened with fury for just a second before the mask of concern slipped back into place. That was my moment. While Thomas was on his hands and knees frantically trying to save the rug, I looked at him with the most pathetic, clouded expression I could manage. I let my voice quaver as I asked him a question that seemed to come from nowhere, a rambling thought from a deteriorating mind. I asked him if he'd ever heard back from that lovely investment manager, a Mr. Sterling, the one with the exclusive offshore fund. I told him I was thinking of making a rather large investment myself and wondered if he was still taking clients. Thomas froze. It was as if I'd flicked a switch and turned him to stone. The color drained from his face, leaving behind a waxy gray pallor. He stared at me, his eyes wide with a terror that was so pure, so absolute. It confirmed everything. Mr. Sterling, the architect of their ruin. Clarissa saw it too. She swept into the room, her voice sharp, telling me Mr. Sterling had retired suddenly and moved away. It was a clumsy, obvious lie. Later that day, I asked them about him separately. Thomas told me he'd passed away while Clarissa stuck to her story about retirement. Their guilt was no longer a secret. It was a blaring alarm. Their panic was my opportunity. A few hours later, I made my way to the living room, faking a dizzy spell. I swayed on my feet and pressed a hand to my forehead, moaning softly. Before Clarissa could rush to my side to help, I told her I just needed a moment alone, that I was going to lock myself in the master bathroom to splash some water on my face. It was the one room in the house where I could expect absolute privacy. Once inside, I bolted the door. My hands were shaking for real this time, not with weakness, but with adrenaline. Hidden in the back of a dusty vanity case wrapped in silk was an old prepaid burner phone Arthur had given me years ago as a joke. I'd kept it charged just in case. My fingers flew over the numbers, dialing a contact I hadn't spoken to in years, my grandniece Sarah. She was a paralegal in Queens, a sharp, no-nonsense young woman the family had ostracized for being too independent. I knew I had one call, one chance. When she answered, I didn't waste a second. I told her it was her Aunt Eleanor. I spoke the two words we had agreed upon a decade ago, a silly code for a dire emergency code Nightingale. I told her I needed a legal consultation immediately. Then I hung up, erased the call log, and switched off the phone. A single flare had been sent up into the night. Now I could only pray she saw it. My performance must have been too convincing, because when I emerged from the bathroom, the panic in their eyes had hardened into something new, resolve. They felt exposed, and they were reacting. That evening, Clarissa approached me with a brochure, her voice oozing with false cheer. She announced she had booked me a 2-week stay at a wonderful holistic detox retreat upstate, a place to rest and recuperate. The brochure showed serene mountains and smiling guests, but I saw only what it was meant to hide. It was remote. It had no cell service. It was the perfect place to finish a job without any witnesses. This wasn't a retreat. It was my designated grave. The game had changed. They had called my bluff, and in doing so had moved the final deadline from some unknown future date to right now. To their profound relief, and I suspect a little bit of surprise, I didn't fight them on the retreat. When Clarissa showed me the brochure, I let my shoulders slump. I feigned a weary resignation, a sort of defeated sigh that told them the fight had gone out of me. I told her it sounded lovely, that maybe some time away was exactly what I needed. It was a masterful performance, if I do say so myself. Their entire demeanor shifted. The coiled tension in Clarissa's posture relaxed, and even Thomas managed something that resembled a genuine smile. They believed they had won. They convinced themselves that my question about that investor, Mr. Sterling, had been nothing more than a random senile misfire from a dying mind. Their quick action, they thought, had neutralized the threat, and now their little lamb was going to the slaughter without a fuss. They were so busy congratulating themselves, they didn't see the wolf putting on the sheep's clothing. I didn't know the full story then, of course. I only knew their motive was money. It was only later, after everything, that I was able to piece together the full, pathetic tapestry of their desperation. They had been at a lavish charity gala at their country club, the kind of event where wealth isn't just displayed, it's a prerequisite for entry. There they were charmed by a charismatic man who spoke of rare earth minerals and exclusive funds with guaranteed returns. They, who had inherited so much and earned so little, fell for it completely. They didn't just invest, they liquidated nearly everything Thomas was set to inherit from his father and poured it all into this man's hands. It was, of course, a sophisticated Ponzi scheme. The threatening emails had started a month ago, culminating in a final notice on their laptop. A message I can now picture with perfect clarity: assets will be seized. Eviction proceedings commence in 30 days. Their social ruin wasn't a distant fear, it was a ticking clock. My death was the only thing that could reset it. So while they saw me napping in my chair or slowly packing a small suitcase with Clarissa's helpful supervision, I was doing anything but surrendering. In the quiet of my room under the covers at night, the little burner phone became my weapon. My grandniece Sarah had received the code Nightingale. She texted back a single perfect word: acknowledged. That was all I needed. I began to issue my commands, typing out short, encrypted messages. My first instruction was for her to contact David, my lawyer for over 40 years. He was semi-retired, but I knew his loyalty was absolute. I told her to tell him I needed him to be my executor effective immediately, and that circumstances were unusual. My next text was an authorization. I told her to hire a private investigator, the best she could find, and to spare no expense. Their job was to put a microscope on Thomas and Clarissa's entire life, their finances, their communications, their every move. And then came the most important instruction. I described a small, unassuming key hidden in the false bottom of my old sewing box. I told her it opened safe deposit box 312 at a small independent bank downtown. I instructed her to go there alone, present the key and the letter of authorization I had hidden with it, and to prepare herself for what she would find. You see, Arthur was a wonderful man, but he wasn't a fool. He loved our son, but he saw his weakness, his susceptibility to vanity and bad judgment. The vast majority of our fortune, the $13.2 million estate Thomas knew about, was just the public face of our wealth. Arthur had spent decades building a second, completely separate fortune through shrewd, quiet investments, a portfolio that existed off the books, unknown to anyone but me. It was our secret, our real legacy, and it was all in my name. The contents of that box would give Sarah the resources she needed to wage this war for me. My compliance had made my captors careless. They believed they were in the final stretch, their prize just within reach. And in her arrogance, Clarissa made a fatal mistake. High on her perceived victory, she went on a shopping spree. The private investigator Sarah hired had barely been on the job for a day when he flagged an alert. A purchase had been made on my primary credit card, a card Clarissa had control of for groceries and essentials. But this was no bag of groceries. It was a $30,000 watch from a boutique on Madison Avenue. She had bought herself an inheritance present before the body was even cold. The investigator sent a screenshot of the receipt to Sarah, who forwarded it to me. I looked at the image on my little burner phone, a beautifully crafted timepiece that might as well have been a pair of handcuffs. It was the first piece of hard, irrefutable evidence, the first bar of a new cage, one she was building for herself. The morning air was thick with a sense of grim purpose. My small suitcase was packed and waiting by the front door. Clarissa was flitting around the house with a frantic, bird-like energy. Her cheerfulness so forced it was almost manic. Thomas was a ghost, pale and silent, avoiding my eyes. They were ready to take me to the retreat. They were ready to conclude their business. But my team had its own schedule. Just as Thomas was picking up my bag, the doorbell rang, a sharp, authoritative chime that cut through the tense atmosphere. Clarissa opened the door, her practiced smile of welcome freezing on her face. It wasn't a driver. It was Sarah, my grandniece, looking composed and utterly professional in a dark pantsuit. Beside her stood David, my old lawyer, his face a thundercloud of controlled fury, a worn leather briefcase held tightly in his hand. They stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. Sarah's voice was calm, but it sliced through the room like a shard of ice. She announced that they were there to discuss a preliminary audit of my estate, specifically the recent liquidation of my primary brokerage account. It was a brilliant lie, a perfectly crafted piece of bait. There had been no liquidation, of course, but they didn't know that. They only knew that their own finances were a crater of debt and secrets. Cornered and ambushed, they crumbled. David was relentless. He wasn't the gentle, semi-retired friend I knew. He was a surgeon, his questions sharp and precise, cutting away at their fabricated stories layer by layer. He asked about my assets, about the documents I had signed, about the sudden need for a detox retreat when my own doctor had not been consulted. Thomas broke first. It was a complete and total collapse. He sank into a chair, his head in his hands, and began to sob, great racking sounds of a man utterly defeated. The whole pathetic story came pouring out of him in a torrent of self-pity and shame. He confessed everything: the charming con man, the Ponzi scheme, the bankruptcy, the crushing terror of their friends and neighbors finding out they were failures. He tried to frame their plan to kill me as some sort of desperate, misguided attempt to save themselves and to end my suffering, as if he were doing me a kindness. I had expected Clarissa to break too. I was wrong. Her mask of serene composure didn't just slip. It shattered, revealing something reptilian and full of venom underneath. She turned on her weeping husband, her voice a low, vicious hiss. She called him a weak, pathetic fool. She shrieked that she had built their entire life, their reputation, their status, and he had let a cheap con man dismantle it all. The united front of dutiful caregivers dissolved into a hideous scene of bitter, ugly accusations. In that moment, they exposed the rotten, toxic core of their marriage for all of us to see. I had remained silent in my armchair through it all, watching the drama unfold as if it were a play. Now it was time for the protagonist to take the stage. I spoke a single word, my voice clear and powerful, utterly devoid of the feebleness I had been feigning for weeks. Enough. The room fell silent. Slowly, deliberately, I rose to my feet. I wasn't the stooped, frail woman they had been poisoning. I stood tall, my back straight, my gaze unwavering. The trip, I informed them, was canceled. I then announced that David would be taking over the management of this house and all my affairs effective immediately. And as for them, they would not leave this property until I said so. They were no longer my caregivers. They were my captives. I watched the realization dawn on their faces, the confusion giving way to disbelief and then to a final horrifying understanding. They hadn't been dealing with a victim. They had been surviving a hunter. The 2 weeks that followed were a masterclass in silence. My house, once their prison for me, became theirs. David handled everything. Groceries were delivered, bills were paid. They were given access to their rooms and the main living areas, but they were otherwise cut off from the world. Their cell phones had been confiscated, the internet was turned off. There were no more hushed, vicious arguments in the hallway. There was only a heavy, suffocating quiet, the kind that forces you to live with nothing but the sound of your own monstrous thoughts. I stayed in my wing of the house, letting them stew in the poison of their own making. It wasn't about cruelty. It was about giving their guilt the time and space it needed to fester. Then the summons came. David informed them that a car would be arriving to take them to his office in Manhattan. They were disheveled and looked as if they had aged a decade. I think they had convinced themselves this was the end of it, that they would be presented with a settlement, a small inheritance to buy their silence and make them disappear. When they were led into the formal boardroom, their hope evaporated. It was a cold, sterile room, all glass and polished mahogany, with a panoramic view of the city, they had so desperately wanted to conquer. Waiting for them was not just David, but my longtime accountant and a certified notary public. The atmosphere was glacial. This was not a negotiation. It was a tribunal. David let them sit in silence for a few minutes before he began. He calmly announced that they were present for the official reading of my new last will and testament, which I had executed the previous week. He began to read from the document, his voice a steady, dispassionate drone. He detailed with methodical precision how both Thomas, my son, and his wife Clarissa were to be formally and completely disinherited due to gross misconduct, financial malfeasance, and endangerment. They erupted, of course. Clarissa shot to her feet, her voice a shrill cry of protest, Thomas mumbling incoherently beside her. David simply held up a hand silencing them. He told them that actually Mrs. Grace had insisted on explaining this part herself. Then he turned and switched on a large monitor mounted on the wall. And there I was. Not the frail, confused woman they had tried to murder, but a version of me they had never seen. I was dressed in a sharp, elegant suit, my hair was perfectly styled, and my eyes were clear and direct. It was a recorded video will of final testament they were forced to watch while I was very much alive. With chilling precision, I laid out my case. I told the story of their care, and then I began to present the evidence. First came the audio. The private investigator had managed to plant a tiny microphone in the living room. Their own voices filled the silent boardroom, the hushed, vicious argument in the hallway, the discussion of the poison, Clarissa's cold dismissal of my life as a conclusion. Next, I presented the lab analysis of the wellness tea, a neat clinical report from an independent lab confirming lethal cumulative doses of digitalis. Then their bankrupt financial statements appeared on screen, a sea of red ink and final notices displayed right next to a high-resolution image of the receipt for Clarissa's $30,000 watch. Every lie was exposed. Every secret was laid bare. Then on the screen, I delivered the final crushing blow. I announced that my entire estate, the $13.2 million they knew about, plus the second secret fortune they had no idea existed, was to be left in its entirety to the sole beneficiary of my trust and my love, my grandniece, Sarah. As my image faded from the screen, the boardroom door opened, and the real me walked in. I looked at my son and his wife. Their faces were masks of pure, unadulterated horror. They looked from me to the blank screen and back again, their minds unable to process the reality of it. I didn't say a single word to them. I walked directly to David, took the newly signed and notarized will from his hand, and passed a copy to a stunned and wide-eyed Sarah, who was seeing the full document for the first time herself. Then I turned to her, ignoring the two broken people who were now nothing more than ghosts in the room. I told her, my voice crisp and clear, that if she would excuse us, we had a lunch reservation. That lunch with Sarah, just moments after the world had been remade, was one of the strangest and most wonderful meals of my life. We didn't talk about what had happened in that boardroom. We didn't talk about money or betrayal or poison. We talked about art and books, and a trip she had once taken to the coast of Maine. It was as if a great, heavy curtain had been lifted, and we were simply two people, an aunt and her niece, getting to know each other in the bright, clear light of a new day. In the weeks that followed, I didn't have to seek out news of Thomas and Clarissa. The collapse was so total, so absolute, that the tremors reached me even in the quiet of my home. David kept me informed. Their home, which had been mortgaged to the hilt, was foreclosed on within a month. I saw pictures of movers packing their life into boxes, the curated evidence of their stolen status hauled away in a truck. Friends who had once flocked to their parties now crossed the street to avoid them. Whispers followed them in the aisles of the grocery store. The social world they had sacrificed their souls to maintain had not just shunned them, it had brutally and efficiently erased them. Their exile was absolute. From there, their paths split each according to their nature. Thomas, stripped of his pride and his wife's ambition, simply disappeared. He packed a bag, left a note, and vanished from the life he had known. Months later, David's investigator located him working a menial job under a different name in a dreary industrial town hundreds of miles away. It was a slow, anonymous, and deeply pathetic journey toward accepting what he had done. Clarissa, however, remained defiantly herself. She chose to fight. She filed a frivolous lawsuit to contest the will of final, pathetic grasp for money and relevance. It was summarily dismissed by a judge in a matter of minutes, the video I had made serving as the only evidence required. After that, she too faded into obscurity, a bitter woman consumed by a rage that had no one left to burn but herself. While their world was shrinking to a pinprick of shame and failure, mine was blossoming. Sarah, after the initial shock, proved to be exactly the partner I knew she would be. Sharp, compassionate, and utterly unimpressed by the scale of her new inheritance. Together, we began my lifelong dream. We found a run-down, forgotten community theater in a neighboring town, and with the full force of my reclaimed fortune, we began to bring it back to life. The months were filled with the smell of sawdust and fresh paint, the sounds of construction, and the laughter of the artists and community members who joined our cause. I was surrounded by a new, chosen family people who valued me for my stories and my wisdom, not for the number on a bank statement. I was vibrant, I was laughing, and for the first time in a very long time, I was truly free. 6 months later, I was sitting in the front row of the newly dedicated Grace Arts Pavilion, named for Arthur and me. The velvet seats were full, the lights were warm, and on stage a group of children were putting on a wonderfully chaotic play. Sarah slid into the seat next to me and quietly passed me a piece of mail that had arrived that morning. It was a worn postcard showing a picture of a bleak, gray factory town. On the back, in Thomas's familiar handwriting, was a single tear-stained sentence. Just 3 words, "I am sorry." I read it, and a complex wave of emotions washed over me, a deep, aching sorrow for the son I had lost, but also a quiet, steady peace with the choice I had made. It was an acknowledgement, not an absolution. I folded the postcard and placed it in my purse. Then I turned my full attention back to the stage, to the joyful, imperfect, and beautiful noise of the children. My life and my legacy were finally, entirely my own. Eleanor's story is a powerful lesson in seeing the strength that lies beneath a quiet surface. Her family made the fatal mistake of viewing her as a conclusion, a frail final chapter in a story they wanted to control. They were so blinded by their own desperate greed that they never saw the brilliant strategic mind watching their every move. While their financial ruin was real, their cruelty was a choice. In the end, Eleanor's patience and hidden resources completely unraveled their lives. It shows that the most formidable power isn't loud and aggressive, but wise, observant, and knows exactly when to act.